Nathan Reed leaned back in his chair, the gleaming city skyline of glass towers and bustling streets stretching beyond his office window. From here, atop his empire, the world seemed manageable, contained. A world of figures, quarterly reports, and well-managed crises. To anyone on the outside, Nathan was a man who had mastered every aspect of life, powerful, wealthy, and widely respected. Yet, there was a growing ache inside him, a gnawing sense of something missing. His life had become an endless cycle of board meetings, conference calls, and public appearances where he would be lauded as a philanthropist, praised for his donations to hospitals, medical research, and community health initiatives. But the applause felt hollow. Nathan's charitable acts, once driven by purpose, now seemed detached from the reality of the people they were meant to help. His phone buzzed, pulling him from his thoughts. It was another congratulatory message, this time about the expansion of a new medical facility bearing his name, the Nathan Reed Medical Center. The irony stung. He hadn't stepped inside one of his hospitals in years, at least not beyond a ribbon-cutting ceremony or a staged photo op. He was disconnected, shielded by his wealth and status from the very struggles his empire was meant to alleviate. A deep sigh escaped him. He stood and walked over to the window, staring down at the city below, where countless lives moved in a rhythm far different from his own. They lived in a world of shifts, paychecks, and everyday struggles, far removed from his insulated reality. It was then that the idea began to form, tentative at first, then gaining strength as he mulled it over. What if he could immerse himself in their world? Not as Nathan Reed, the CEO, but as someone else, someone ordinary. The thought excited him in a way he hadn't felt in years. A second chance, not just to see his company through a different lens, but to understand what it was like for those working in the very heart of it. It was bold, perhaps even reckless, but it was the only way. He had to reconnect with the people who depended on the health system he had built, both the patients and the staff who carried the weight of his decisions daily. Nathan spent the next few days in quiet preparation, his plan unfolding in secret. He would become Lucas, a man with no ties to his fortune or power. He would work at one of his own hospitals, the one that carried his name. No one would know who he was. For the first time in years, he would be anonymous. He trimmed his hair, exchanged his expensive suits for simple, worn clothes, and left behind the trappings of wealth that had defined him for so long. When he looked at himself in the mirror, the transformation was startling. Lucas stared back at him, unremarkable, unnoticed. It was a liberation of sorts. The morning he arrived at the hospital was colder than he expected. The stark white building loomed ahead, the bold lettering of his name shining from the facade. But today, he wasn't here as Nathan Reed. Today, he was just another worker stepping through the sliding glass doors, feeling the rush of the hospital's energy hit him like a wave. Doctors, nurses, and patients moved about, their lives interwoven with one another in a chaotic, delicate dance of care and crisis. As Lucas, he entered the hospital's heart, the busy hallways, the beeping machines, the constant murmur of voices. It was overwhelming, and for the first time in a long time, he felt a strange combination of fear and excitement. There was no going back now. Lucas walked through the hospital's halls, trying to absorb the sheer intensity of the place. The sterile smell of disinfectant lingered in the air, blending with the faint scent of coffee from the staff lounge nearby. Nurses moved swiftly, checking charts, adjusting IVs, and offering quick smiles to patients as they passed. Doctors huddled in groups, consulting on cases, their voices low but hurried. The environment was a storm of motion and purpose, something Nathan had never experienced firsthand, at least not like this. His first stop was human resources. The woman behind the desk barely glanced up as she handed him a stack of papers. "Lucas Anderson, right? You'll be working as an orderly. Orientation starts tomorrow, but you can report to the floor today." Her tone was matter-of-fact, efficient. To her, he was just another name, another body to fill a necessary role. Nathan, or Lucas, as he had to remind himself, nodded and took the forms, walking towards the staff locker room. He found his assigned locker, shoved his meager belongings inside, and pulled on the scrubs that had been issued to him. They were loose, a bit too big, and entirely unfamiliar. Gone were the tailored suits, the leather shoes, the luxury watch that had once felt like part of his skin. He felt stripped down, vulnerable in a way he hadn't anticipated. Stepping out onto the floor for the first time, Lucas was immediately absorbed into the pulse of the hospital. He didn't have time to overthink. Tasks were assigned rapidly, transporting patients from room to room, cleaning up after emergencies, assisting nurses when they needed an extra pair of hands. It was grunt work, often unnoticed by most, but Lucas welcomed the anonymity. Every task was a new insight into the reality of those who worked under his name. He moved quickly, mimicking the rhythm of those around him, until he found himself at the nurse's station. That's when he first saw her, Grace Miller. Even from a distance, there was something magnetic about her presence. She was calm but commanding, her voice carrying easily over the controlled chaos of the floor. Her dark hair was pulled back tightly, accentuating the sharp lines of her face. But it was her eyes that struck Lucas the most. They were filled with an intensity that seemed to burn from within, yet softened whenever she spoke to a patient. "Excuse me," she said, catching his eye as she glanced at his badge. "Lucas, right?" Her tone was polite but hurried, like she had 100 things on her mind but still took the time to acknowledge him. "Yeah, that's me," he replied, hoping his voice didn't betray his nerves. "Can you help me with something?" she asked, already leading him towards a nearby room without waiting for a response. Inside, an elderly patient was struggling to sit up in bed. Grace moved swiftly to her side, her hands gentle but firm as she guided the woman into a more comfortable position. "Could you grab that blanket for me?" Lucas moved quickly, handing her the blanket and watching as Grace tucked it around the patient with a care that surprised him. She spoke softly to the woman, her words a quiet comfort that seemed to ease the tension in the room. "Thank you," Grace said, giving Lucas a brief but genuine smile before turning her attention back to the patient. For the rest of the day, Lucas found himself gravitating towards Grace, watching the way she worked with a mix of efficiency and empathy. She was tireless, moving from patient to patient, solving problems, making decisions, and always with that same quiet grace. He admired her dedication, her ability to connect with people in a way that he, Nathan Reed, had long forgotten how to do. The more he observed her, the more Lucas realized just how far removed he had become from the human side of his business. To him, hospitals had been numbers, profits, and expansions. But to Grace, and to the people who relied on her, it was life. It was survival. As the day wore on, Lucas found himself carrying Grace's instructions in his head. Assist with this, transport that, and learning the rhythm of the floor. By the time his shift ended, he was exhausted, his body aching in ways it hadn't in years. But it was a good kind of exhaustion, a feeling of having done something real, something that mattered. Walking out of the hospital that evening, Lucas felt the cool night air hit his face. For the first time in a long while, he wasn't thinking about profits or projections. He wasn't Nathan Reed, the magnate. He was Lucas, just another worker in the chaotic heartbeat of the hospital. But as he glanced back at the towering letters of his name on the building, a thought crossed his mind. How much longer could he keep up this facade? How much longer could he live this lie, pretending to be someone he wasn't? That was a question for another day. For now, he had a shift to prepare for tomorrow. The morning light filtered through the hospital windows as Lucas stepped back onto the floor, the sounds of beeping monitors and distant voices already familiar to him. He was settling into the routine now, though every day felt like a new challenge. Today was no different. As he walked toward the nurse's station, he spotted Grace, her posture straight, her expression focused as she scanned a patient's chart. "Good morning, Lucas," she said without looking up, sensing his presence as he approached. There was something in the way she spoke his name, a quiet acknowledgement, an understanding that he was learning, watching, and trying to fit into this world. "Morning, Grace," he replied, hoping he sounded as at ease as she did. He wasn't. Every day, the weight of who he really was sat heavily on his shoulders. But being around her, watching how she handled every situation with a blend of competence and compassion, made it harder to think about himself. "You ready to move?" Grace asked, handing him a chart. "Room 312. We need to transfer Mrs. Kinney for a CT scan." Her voice was steady, but her eyes flashed with the constant pressure of the day ahead. She didn't have time for niceties, but there was always a trace of kindness behind her instructions, a warmth that never quite left. Lucas nodded, quickly following her down the hallway. When they reached Mrs. Kinney's room, the elderly woman looked up, her frail body almost lost in the hospital bed's sterile white sheets. Grace moved beside her, her voice low and soothing as she explained the procedure, making sure the woman felt safe in her care. It was a small moment, easily overlooked by others, but Lucas couldn't stop noticing how Grace made everyone she touched feel a little less afraid. He helped lift Mrs. Kinney onto the stretcher, careful to follow Grace's lead, mimicking the way she moved, the way she spoke. It wasn't just about getting the task done. It was about making the patient feel human, cared for. Grace's presence filled the room with a quiet calm, and Lucas found himself trying to channel that same energy. They wheeled Mrs. Kinney through the corridors, passing bustling nurses, doctors deep in conversation, and patients lost in their own worlds of pain and recovery. The hospital was alive with activity, each corner brimming with stories that Lucas had never paid attention to before. Now, he couldn't ignore them. As they reached the radiology department, Lucas caught a glimpse of something in Grace's eyes, a flicker of exhaustion, a heaviness that seemed to settle there for just a moment before she pushed it aside. He wondered how she carried all of this, day in and day out. "You okay?" he asked quietly, hoping he wasn't overstepping. Grace turned her head slightly, her lips curving into a small, tired smile. "I'm fine," she said, though there was a hint of something deeper beneath the surface. "It's just part of the job." Lucas wanted to say more, to ask her how she managed to keep going with such strength, but the moment passed too quickly. Mrs. Kinney was being prepped for her scan, and Grace was already turning away, focused on the next task. The rest of the day moved in a blur of activity, but Grace remained at the center of Lucas's attention. She was like a force of nature, quietly holding the hospital together without ever drawing attention to herself. He began to realize that it wasn't just her medical expertise that made her so respected. It was her ability to balance the professional demands of her job with a personal connection to everyone she encountered. By the time their shifts overlapped again in the afternoon, Grace's energy hadn't wavered, but Lucas could see the strain in her eyes. They worked side by side for a while, not saying much, until Grace broke the silence as they stood outside a patient's room. "You're picking things up fast," she said, glancing at him. "Most new hires take weeks to adjust to the pace here." Lucas shrugged, trying to play it off. "I guess I'm a fast learner." She laughed softly, a sound that felt like a reward after the day's tension. "Well, keep it up. We need more people who can handle it." There was a pause before she continued, her tone becoming more thoughtful. "It's hard work, Lucas, and it doesn't get easier." He didn't know what to say. How could he? She had been doing this for years, living this reality, while he had only just stepped into it under a false identity. He wasn't the one who had to carry the weight of real responsibility day after day. But something in her voice made him want to stay, to prove he could be a part of this world, even if only for a little while. Grace's pager beeped, interrupting the moment. "I've got to check on a patient." "See you later?" she asked, her expression softening for just a second before she turned to leave. Lucas watched her walk away, her pace quickening as she dove back into the constant demands of the hospital. He stood there for a moment, feeling the pull of two lives inside him. On one hand, he was Nathan Reed, the man who had built this empire from the ground up, the one responsible for so many of the decisions that shaped this hospital. But here, as Lucas, he was just a worker, someone learning, trying to understand the complexity of the world his company affected. The day had worn him down, but it had also opened his eyes. Grace Miller wasn't just a cog in the machine. She was the heartbeat of the hospital, keeping it alive with her dedication and resilience. And Lucas, in the middle of it all, was starting to see his own reflection in the work she did, realizing how far he had drifted from the very people who held his empire together. Lucas stood near the nurse's station, watching Grace handle the latest crisis with her usual calm efficiency. A new patient had just been admitted, an older man struggling to breathe, his family trailing behind him, their faces twisted with worry. Grace moved between them and the medical team, offering explanations, reassurances, and, most importantly, control. It was clear to everyone who looked at her. She knew what she was doing, and she cared deeply about getting it right. Lucas marveled at her ability to juggle the intensity of her job without letting the pressure show. She was like a bridge between chaos and comfort, always finding a way to steady the storm. And yet, he could see the cracks beneath her surface. She wasn't as invincible as she appeared. He had noticed the slight tremor in her hands when she thought no one was looking, the way her eyes lingered on certain patients just a little longer. There was a story behind those eyes, and he found himself wanting to know more. As the day wore on, Lucas found himself working more closely with Grace. Their interactions were brief, but meaningful. He assisted where he could, taking cues from her without needing to ask for instructions. It felt natural, like they were beginning to develop an unspoken rhythm. Yet, he could sense a distance in her, a wall she had carefully constructed, keeping everyone, including him, at arm's length. He wanted to break through, to understand the weight she was carrying. Later in the day, they were transferring a patient back to his room when Grace's phone buzzed. She pulled it from her pocket and frowned slightly, her expression tightening as she read the message. Lucas glanced at her, noticing the shift in her demeanor. "Everything okay?" he asked, trying to sound casual but unable to hide his concern. Grace hesitated, her eyes flickering over his face before she offered a small, strained smile. "Yeah, just some personal stuff." She quickly shoved the phone back into her pocket and resumed, pushing the patient's bed toward the elevator. Lucas didn't press, but the tension in her voice stuck with him. It wasn't the first time he had noticed it, a subtle crack in her otherwise flawless composure. He remembered the brief mentions of her brother from some of the nurses, how he had died recently. The thought gnawed at him, though he still didn't know the details. And then there was the other piece, the part that made his stomach churn. The possibility that his own company, his decisions, might be linked to her pain. Once the patient was settled, they walked back toward the station in silence. Lucas wanted to ask her more, to offer some kind of support, but something in her posture kept him from doing so. Grace wasn't the type to open up easily, and he respected that. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that whatever she was holding inside was slowly eroding her from within. As they approached the station, one of the doctors flagged Grace down, pulling her into a conversation about a critical patient. Lucas watched as she nodded along, already shifting gears back into professional mode. He couldn't help but admire her ability to compartmentalize her emotions so flawlessly, even if it came at a personal cost. He leaned against the counter, waiting for his next task, when one of the other nurses, a woman named Carla, sidled up next to him. She was friendly, always quick with a joke or a piece of gossip, but today her expression was softer, more thoughtful. "You've been sticking close to Grace, huh?" Carla asked, raising an eyebrow. "You should know. She's been through a lot." Lucas turned to her, curious. "What do you mean?" Carla glanced over at Grace, who was still deep in conversation with the doctor. She lowered her voice. "Her brother. He died not too long ago. Medical negligence, from what I've heard. He was in another hospital, not too far from here. It's been hard on her, but you wouldn't know it just by looking at her, would you?" Lucas felt the air leave his lungs. The pieces were coming together, but they painted a picture far darker than he had imagined. His mind raced, connecting dots he didn't want to connect. If her brother's death had been due to negligence, and it happened at a hospital within his network, there was a good chance. No, he couldn't go there. Not yet. He swallowed, keeping his voice steady. "That's awful. I didn't know." Carla nodded, her eyes soft with sympathy. "She doesn't talk about it much, but we all know she's carrying it around with her. She's tough, though, stronger than most people give her credit for." Lucas nodded, forcing himself to breathe as the weight of Carla's words settled on him. He couldn't imagine the pain Grace must have been going through, and now the possibility that his own actions could have played a role in her tragedy gnawed at him like a dark, unrelenting shadow. Carla patted his arm, her usual smile returning. "Just thought you should know. She's a good one, worth sticking around for." Lucas gave her a grateful nod, though his mind was spinning. Carla walked away, leaving him standing there, alone with his thoughts. When Grace finished speaking with the doctor and returned to the station, She shot him a brief look, her eyes tired but still carrying that same spark of determination. "You ready to keep going?" she asked, her voice steady despite everything she was holding inside. Lucas nodded. Always. But inside, he wasn't sure how much longer he could keep pretending. The more he learned about Grace, the more he admired her, and the more guilt settled like a weight in his chest. He was falling deeper into her world, and with every passing day, the truth became harder to avoid. How could he ever tell her who he really was? The thought lingered, heavy and unavoidable, as they moved together through the endless halls of the hospital. Lucas entered the hospital early that morning, the cold air from outside still clinging to him as he stepped through the automatic doors. The hospital, always alive with activity, felt quieter in these early hours. It gave him time to think, though he wasn't sure he wanted to be alone with his thoughts anymore. The knowledge of Grace's past, the weight of her brother's death, had been gnawing at him since the moment Carla told him. The more he tried to push it aside, the more it consumed him. He was drawn to her now, more than ever, not just because of her strength or her kindness, but because he knew she was living with a pain he was, in some way, responsible for. He just didn't know how to confront it, or if he even could. Grace was already on the floor, of course. She always arrived before anyone else, already immersed in the day's tasks, her focus razor-sharp. Today was no different. Lucas spotted her by the nurse's station, her fingers tapping out notes on a tablet, her brow furrowed in concentration. But there was something else in her posture today, an extra layer of exhaustion that even she couldn't hide. He approached her slowly, unsure of how to break through the fog of his own guilt. "Hey," he said, his voice soft. She looked up, blinking in surprise as though she hadn't realized he was there. "Hey," she replied, her smile faint but genuine. "You're early." Lucas shrugged. "Figured I'd get a head start." Grace nodded, but her eyes drifted away, lost in thought. It wasn't like her to be so distracted. She was always so present, so focused on the moment. Today, though, something was pulling her attention elsewhere. "Everything okay?" Lucas asked, the question slipping out before he could stop himself. Grace hesitated, her eyes scanning the hallway as if weighing whether to let him in or not. Finally, she sighed, leaning against the counter. "It's just, today would have been my brother's birthday," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. The words hit Lucas like a punch to the gut. He swallowed, trying to keep his expression neutral, though inside he felt like the floor had just dropped out from beneath him. "I'm sorry, Grace," he said, and he meant it. Every part of him meant it. She nodded, her eyes flickering with something that looked like grief and anger all at once. "Yeah, it's just one of those days, you know? You think you're doing fine, and then something reminds you, and it's like the wound is fresh all over again." Lucas wanted to reach out, to touch her shoulder or take her hand, to offer something more than empty words. But he didn't. He couldn't. The distance between them felt insurmountable in that moment, even though they were standing inches apart. What was he like? Lucas asked gently, hoping to give her space to talk if she wanted to. Grace smiled, a sad, wistful curve of her lips. He was stubborn. God, he was so stubborn. But he had the biggest heart. He always stood up for people, even when he didn't need to. He just cared. About everyone. Her eyes grew distant as she spoke, her voice softening with memory. He would have made an amazing doctor. That's what he was studying to be. Lucas's chest tightened. This was too much. Too real. His own decisions, the cost-cutting measures, the focus on efficiency over care, had led to her brother's death. The man who would have made an amazing doctor never had the chance because of him. But she couldn't know that. Not yet. Maybe not ever. "I'm sure he would have," Lucas said, his voice strained. Grace turned to look at him, her eyes searching his face as if she could sense something beneath his words. "What about you?" she asked, catching him off guard. "You ever lose anyone close to you?" The question hung between them, heavy with meaning. For a moment, Lucas didn't know what to say. His life had been defined by business, by success, by building an empire. He hadn't allowed room for personal loss, at least not in the same way Grace had. But he had lost something, even if it wasn't a person. I lost my way, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. I got so wrapped up in work, in everything, that I forgot why I was doing it in the first place. Grace's gaze softened. She didn't press him, didn't pry for details, but there was understanding in her eyes. She nodded slowly, as if she knew exactly what he meant. It's easy to lose sight of things, she said, especially in a place like this. It's all about moving forward, about survival. You forget to stop and breathe. Her words settled into Lucas like a weight, but not a burdensome one. It was a reminder, a truth he had needed to hear. He had forgotten to breathe, to remember the humanity in everything he had built. Being here, alongside her, was reminding him of what he had lost, and what he might still have a chance to find. Before he could say anything more, Grace's pager beeped, pulling her back to the present. She glanced down at it and sighed. "I've got to check on a patient," she said, her voice tinged with reluctant exhaustion. Lucas nodded, stepping back to let her go. But before she turned to leave, she paused, looking at him with something close to gratitude in her eyes. "Thanks, Lucas," she said softly. "For what?" he asked, genuinely confused. "For listening," she replied, her smile small but real. Lucas watched her walk away, his heart heavy and his mind spinning. He had spent so much time trying to distance himself from the consequences of his actions, hiding behind the identity of Lucas to escape the weight of Nathan Reed's empire. But now, standing in the shadow of Grace's pain, he realized he couldn't run from it forever. The truth would come out. It had to. The only question was when. The hospital hummed with its usual urgency as Lucas moved through the corridors, the weight of Grace's words still lingering in his chest. Every time he passed a nurse or patient, he felt the pressure building, the gnawing sense that his secret was becoming impossible to bear. He had entered this world to reconnect with the humanity his empire had overshadowed, but now it was clear. The very system he had built had hurt the person he was beginning to care about most. His eyes found Grace as she emerged from a patient's room, her expression calm but exhausted. She'd been running on empty since the moment they met, and now he understood why. Her brother's death. He couldn't shake it from his mind. The guilt he had been trying to push down was now a constant presence, an ache in his gut. Grace spotted him, offering a tired smile as she approached. "Busy morning?" "Always," Lucas replied, though the words felt distant. He couldn't help but notice the faint shadows under her eyes, the way her smile never quite reached them anymore. She leaned against the nurse's station, glancing at the clock. "Feels like these days get longer, don't they?" "Yeah," Lucas said softly. "I guess when you're carrying a lot, time slows down." Grace gave him a brief, curious look, but she didn't ask what he meant. Instead, she reached for her tablet and checked the next patient's chart. "Mr. Dunleavy in room 407 is due for his medication. You want to help me with that?" "Sure," he said, falling into step beside her as they made their way down the hall. The room was quiet when they entered, except for the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor. Mr. Dunleavy, a frail man in his 70s, lay still, his breathing shallow but steady. Grace moved with practiced care, checking his and adjusting the monitors as Lucas handed her the medication tray. "Mr. Dunleavy," Grace said gently, her voice low and reassuring, "it's time for your meds." The old man opened his eyes, blinking slowly as he focused on her face. His lips curved into a faint smile. "You're an angel," he murmured, his voice hoarse. Grace smiled back, though Lucas could see the sadness in her eyes. "Just doing my job," she replied, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear as she prepared his medication. Lucas watched, feeling a strange mix of admiration and guilt. She had no idea how much her kindness and dedication meant to the people in this hospital, how deeply she affected their lives. And here he was, hiding the truth from her, watching as she carried the burden of a loss he was partly responsible for. As they finished up in the room, Grace glanced over at Lucas. "You're quiet today." "I guess I've just been thinking," he admitted. She tilted her head slightly, her expression softening. "About what?" "About how things can change so fast," Lucas said, his voice hesitant. "One decision can alter someone's life, and you don't even realize it until it's too late." Grace stared at him for a moment, something unreadable passing behind her eyes. She sighed, nodding as she folded her arms. Yeah, I know what you mean. Lucas's heart tightened in his chest. This was it. He wanted to tell her. He needed to tell her. But the words lodged in his throat, suffocated by the fear of what would happen if he did. He couldn't bear the thought of losing the fragile connection they'd built, of shattering whatever trust she had in him, even if she didn't know who he really was. They walked in silence back to the nurse's station, the tension between them thick but unspoken. Lucas could feel the weight of his secret pressing down harder with every step. He couldn't keep pretending much longer. The truth was a ticking clock, and he knew that when it finally struck, everything would change. As they reached the station, a voice called out to Grace from down the hall. Dr. Hughes, the hospital's chief of staff, approached with a concerned look on his face. Grace, we need you in the ER. We've got a situation, possible stroke, and we're short-staffed. Grace nodded, already shifting gears. I'm on it. She turned to Lucas. You mind helping Carla with the transfers until I'm back? Lucas nodded, watching as she hurried off with Dr. Hughes, her focus already locked on the next crisis. She didn't have time to think about her own pain, her own struggles. She had built her life around helping others, never asking for anything in return. And that made what he had to do even harder. For the next few hours, Lucas threw himself into work, helping the staff where he could, trying to keep his mind off the storm brewing inside him. But every time he passed Grace, rushing from one emergency to the next, his guilt grew heavier. She deserved to know the truth, no matter how much it would hurt. By the end of the shift, the hospital had settled back into its usual rhythm. The emergencies had been handled, the patients stabilized, and the staff slowly began to wind down. Grace finally returned to the nurse's station, her expression weary but relieved. All good in the ER? Lucas asked, trying to keep his tone light. Yeah, Grace said, rubbing her forehead. It was touch and go for a while, but I think we managed to pull him through. I swear, days like this make you wonder if there's ever an end. Lucas watched her carefully, the way her exhaustion seemed to go deeper than just physical tiredness. He couldn't keep doing this. He couldn't keep pretending to be someone he wasn't while watching her suffer. Grace, he began, his voice quiet but firm. There's something I need to tell you. She looked up at him, her brow furrowing slightly. What is it? Lucas opened his mouth, but the words caught in his throat. He could feel his heart racing, the room suddenly feeling too small, too suffocating. He couldn't do it. Not here. Not now. I just wanted to say that I'm here if you ever need to talk, he said instead, hating himself for backing down again. Grace smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. Thanks, Lucas. That means a lot. She turned away, gathering her things as her shift came to an end. Lucas watched her go, knowing he had missed his chance. But the clock was still ticking, and sooner or later, the truth would have to come out. And when it did, nothing between them would ever be the same. The days blurred into a relentless routine of work and exhaustion. But for Lucas, every moment felt like it carried a heavier weight. The secret he harbored, the truth of who he really was, pressed down on him harder with each passing day. Every time he saw Grace, her eyes tired but determined, it was like a ticking bomb inside his chest, waiting for the inevitable detonation. He knew that soon, very soon, the lie would collapse and everything would fall apart. It was late afternoon when Lucas saw her again, sitting by herself in the staff break room. She was hunched over a cup of coffee, staring blankly at the wall as if trying to will herself through another hour. The usually bustling hospital had settled into a rare moment of calm, and Lucas seized the opportunity to talk to her, even though he had no idea what he was going to say. He approached quietly, hesitating for a moment at the door before stepping inside. Grace didn't look up at first, too lost in her thoughts to notice him. Finally, she sighed, her shoulders sagging with exhaustion, and glanced up. Hey, Lucas said softly, sliding into the chair across from her. Rough day? Grace gave a tired smile, though her eyes still held that distant sadness he had come to recognize. Aren't they all? He nodded, unsure how to respond. He could feel the words building inside him. The truth about his identity, about how he had let this go on for too long, but he couldn't seem to find the courage to release them. He stared at his hands for a moment, gathering his thoughts. "You know," Grace said, her voice breaking the silence, "some days I feel like I'm not even here, like I'm just moving through it all on autopilot." Lucas looked up, surprised at her honesty. "What do you mean?" She sighed, taking a sip of her coffee before setting the cup down with a slight clink. "It's like, no matter how much I do, no matter how many patients I help, I still feel empty, like I'm not doing enough." She paused, her fingers fidgeting with the handle of the cup. "I used to think this work would make me feel closer to him. My brother, I mean, but instead, it just makes me feel farther away." Lucas's chest tightened. He hadn't expected her to open up like this, hadn't been prepared for the rawness of her confession. He wanted to reach across the table, to tell her everything, to explain that the man responsible for the pain she felt was sitting right in front of her. But how could he? How could he destroy the fragile connection they had built? "He would have been proud of you, Grace," Lucas said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know he would have." She met his eyes, and for a moment, he saw the vulnerability in her, the cracks in her armor that she tried so hard to hide. "I just wish he were still here, that I could have done something to stop it." Her voice wavered on the last word, and Lucas felt his heart break a little more. He wanted to tell her it wasn't her fault, that she couldn't have done anything, but he couldn't ignore the fact that he could have. The decisions he had made as Nathan Reed had rippled out and taken her brother's life. "I wish there was something I could say," Lucas began, his throat tight with emotion. "Something to take that pain away." Grace gave him a sad smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. "You've done more than enough already, Lucas. Really. You've been a good friend." The word friend hit him like a punch in the gut. He wasn't her friend. Not really. Not when he was hiding who he truly was. But he smiled back at her, pretending, just like he had been for weeks now. It felt hollow, knowing what he still had to confess. Before he could say anything else, Grace's pager went off, shattering the fragile moment between them. She glanced at it, her face shifting back into her professional mask. "I've got to get back," she said, standing up and draining the last of her coffee. "Thanks for listening, Lucas. I really mean that." He watched her leave, the door swinging shut behind her, and felt the weight of everything that had been left unsaid pressing down on him like a suffocating blanket. The time for pretending was running out. Soon, she would know the truth, and when that happened, everything between them would shatter. That night, Lucas couldn't sleep. He lay awake in his small, sparsely furnished apartment, staring up at the ceiling as the events of the day replayed in his mind. He had to tell her. He couldn't keep lying, not when it was tearing him apart from the inside. The truth was going to come out, whether he wanted it to or not. The next morning, Lucas walked into the hospital feeling heavier than ever. The day dragged on, every conversation, every task weighed down by the knowledge of what he had to do. By the time his shift ended, he couldn't take it anymore. He found Grace alone again, this time in the stairwell, leaning against the cold concrete wall, her eyes closed as she took deep, steadying breaths. She didn't hear him approach, too lost in her own thoughts. "Grace," Lucas said, his voice startling her. She opened her eyes, straightening up as she looked at him. "Hey, you okay?" "No," Lucas said, his voice tight. "I'm not." Grace's brow furrowed, concern flashing in her eyes. "What's wrong?" Lucas could feel his heart pounding in his chest. This was it. There was no going back. "There's something I need to tell you," he said, his words shaky. "Something I should have told you a long time ago." Grace's expression shifted, her eyes narrowing slightly in confusion. "What are you talking about?" Lucas swallowed hard, his throat dry. "My name isn't Lucas," he said, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. "My real name is Nathan Reed." The moment the words left his mouth, he felt the air between them change. Grace froze, her eyes widening in disbelief. For a second, she didn't move, didn't breathe. "What?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I'm Nathan Reed," Lucas repeated, the guilt and fear flooding through him. "The owner of this hospital. Of all the hospitals." Grace stared at him, her face pale, her hands trembling as the realization settled in. "You've been lying to me," she said, her voice shaking with anger. "This whole time, you've been lying." Lucas took a step toward her, desperate to explain. "Grace, I didn't know. I didn't know about your brother, I swear. I didn't know it was my hospital." "But it was," Grace cut him off, her voice rising in fury. "It was your hospital. Your decisions. You let this happen." Lucas felt his chest tighten as he saw the betrayal in her eyes, the deep, searing pain that his confession had caused. He had known this moment would be hard, but he hadn't expected it to feel like this, like he had just torn out his own heart. "I never meant to hurt you," Lucas said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I just wanted to understand. I wanted to be different." Grace shook her head, her eyes filling with tears she refused to let fall. "You don't get to be different. You don't get to pretend like you're someone else and then expect me to forgive you. You took everything from me, Nathan. Everything." She turned away from him, her hands clenched into fists, her whole body trembling with rage and grief. Lucas stood there, frozen, knowing there was nothing he could say to make it right. And as she walked away, the truth finally settled over him like a crushing weight. He had lost her, and he wasn't sure if he would ever get her back. Nathan stood frozen in the stairwell long after Grace had stormed away, her footsteps echoing like gunshots in the hollow space. His mind was racing, but everything felt blurred, fragmented, as if the world had tipped off its axis the moment he uttered his real name. He had known the truth would devastate her, but seeing the raw betrayal in her eyes, hearing the tremor of fury in her voice, it was worse than he had imagined. She had trusted him. He had been her friend, her confidant, and in one confession, he had destroyed all of that. Hours passed, or maybe it was minutes. Time had become irrelevant. The hospital continued its rhythm around him, but Nathan felt disconnected from it, from everything. For the first time in years, he had no control, no plan, no idea of how to fix what he had broken. He had been hiding behind Lucas, convincing himself that living this double life could somehow reconcile his past mistakes. But now, it was all unraveling. He finally moved, his legs feeling like lead as he walked down the deserted corridors. He couldn't face the staff. He couldn't bear to see Grace again. Not yet. So, he walked out of the hospital, the cold air hitting his face like a slap, sharp and unforgiving. Nathan wandered through the city streets, his mind replaying the scene over and over. He saw her face, the hurt in her eyes, the shock, and then the rage. He had never felt so exposed, so utterly unprepared. Grace had been his one anchor, the one person who had shown him what his empire had lost sight of, the humanity in everything. And now, he had torn that apart. As he walked, his phone buzzed incessantly in his pocket. Messages from board members, from hospital administrators, all eager to discuss some business decision or budget cut. He ignored them. For the first time in his life, the world of business, of profits and losses, felt completely meaningless. By the time he reached his apartment, the sky was beginning to darken, a dull gray settling over the city. Inside, everything felt cold, sterile, much like his life had felt before Grace. He sank into the couch, staring blankly at the walls. The silence of the room pressed down on him, suffocating. His thoughts raced, desperate for a solution, but there was none. He had told the truth, and in doing so, he had lost her. The next morning, Nathan woke up after a sleepless night, his mind still heavy with the events of the day before. He knew he couldn't avoid the hospital forever. As much as he wanted to disappear, to let the shame and guilt consume him, he owed it to Grace, and to himself, to face the consequences of his actions. When he walked into the hospital, everything seemed different. The familiar hustle of doctors and nurses, the beeping of monitors, the rush of patients in and out. It all felt distant, like he was observing it from behind a glass wall. He wasn't Nathan Reed, the CEO, or Lucas, the anonymous worker. He was something in between, someone who no longer fit in either world. He made his way through the hallways, nodding absently to the few staff members who greeted him. He couldn't help but notice the way some of them looked at him now, curious, perhaps even suspicious. Had word spread already? Did they know who he really was? When he reached the nurse's station, Grace wasn't there. Carla was, though, her eyes narrowing slightly when she saw him approach. He could feel the weight of her stare, like she was trying to figure him out, trying to understand the man who had been living a lie among them. He didn't have the energy to explain, nor did he think she would listen if he tried. "Grace isn't here today," Carla said, her voice clipped. "She took the day off." Nathan felt a lump form in his throat. Of course, she had. After what he had told her, how could she come back to work? How could she face him, or anyone, after learning the truth? He nodded, swallowing down the guilt that seemed to rise in his chest. "Thanks," he muttered, turning away. He wandered the halls aimlessly after that, unsure of what to do next. He passed patient rooms, saw the nurses going about their rounds, and felt completely disconnected from it all. He used to pride himself on knowing every detail about his hospitals, on running them like a well-oiled machine. But now, that sense of control had slipped away. Hours passed, and the day bled into evening. Nathan found himself standing outside the hospital, staring up at the bold letters of his name on the building's facade. Nathan Reed Medical Center. The words seemed to mock him now, a reminder of the legacy he had built on the backs of people like Grace. People who worked tirelessly, who gave their hearts and souls to their jobs, while he had stood above it all, unaware of the real cost. It was then that he realized what he had to do. The next morning, Nathan walked into the boardroom of his company. The room was filled with familiar faces, executives, administrators, people who had stood by him for years, people who had helped him build this empire. They greeted him with nods and murmurs of approval, all of them eager to get back to business as usual. But today wasn't going to be business as usual. Nathan stood at the head of the table, his hands gripping the back of a chair as he surveyed the room. His heart pounded in his chest, but this time, it wasn't from fear. It was from determination. "We need to talk," he began, his voice steady, though his heart raced with the gravity of what he was about to do. The room fell silent, all eyes turning toward him. The weight of their expectations pressed down on him, but Nathan didn't flinch. "For too long, we've been making decisions based on numbers, on profit margins, on efficiency. And we've forgotten what this company was built for in the first place." A few of the executives exchanged confused glances, but Nathan continued. "People. That's what this company was built on. Helping people. But somewhere along the way, we lost sight of that. I lost sight of that." He paused, letting the words sink in. His heart raced, but he felt more alive in that moment than he had in years. "There are going to be changes," he said firmly. "We're going to stop focusing on cutting corners and start focusing on care. Real care. For our patients, for our staff, for everyone." Murmurs rippled through the room, but Nathan silenced them with a raised hand. He knew there would be resistance, that the board wouldn't understand at first, but he didn't care. This was bigger than profits or shareholder expectations. This was about doing the right thing. "And one more thing," Nathan said, his voice growing softer. "I'm stepping down." The room erupted in protests, shocked voices rising all around him, but Nathan stood firm. He had made his decision. It was time to let go, to hand the reins to someone who could lead this company in a way that stayed true to its original mission. "I've caused too much damage," he said quietly. "It's time for someone else to take over." He left the room without looking back, the weight of his decision lifting slightly as he walked away. It wasn't enough to erase the pain he had caused, but it was a start. And for the first time in a long while, Nathan felt like he was finally doing something right. But even as he walked away, one thought lingered in his mind, pulling at his heart. What would Grace think? Would she ever forgive him? Would she ever understand that this change was all for her? Only time would tell. Nathan stood at the edge of the hospital parking lot, his eyes fixed on the entrance as people moved in and out, their lives carrying on as usual. The cold autumn wind tugged at his jacket, but he barely felt it. His mind was elsewhere, on Grace, on the boardroom, on the life he had just stepped away from. He had made his decision, but the aftermath of it felt hollow. He had taken the first step to repair the damage, but it wasn't enough. Not yet. He knew where he needed to go. The sun was setting as he made his way to Grace's apartment. He'd been there once before, during an after-work gathering when the hospital staff had all gone out for drinks. He hadn't paid much attention then, too focused on maintaining the facade of Lucas. Now, though, every step toward her door felt like a plea, like he was begging for the smallest chance at redemption. When he finally arrived, he stood outside her door, his hand frozen just above the wood. What could he possibly say? How could he explain everything? His lies, his decisions, the havoc he had caused in her life. But he couldn't turn back now. He had to try. He knocked. The sound echoed down the hallway, and for a long moment, there was no response. Just as he was about to knock again, the door opened, and there she was. Grace stood in the doorway, her expression unreadable. Her eyes were red, like she'd been crying, but her face was composed, calm in a way that made Nathan's stomach twist. She wasn't surprised to see him. "Nathan," she said, her voice flat. "What are you doing here?" He swallowed hard, searching for the right words. "I needed to see you. I needed to explain." "Explain?" Grace's eyes darkened, her tone sharp with bitterness. "You mean explain why you pretended to be someone else for weeks? Why you let me open up to you, trust you, all while knowing that you were responsible for everything?" Nathan's heart clenched. "I didn't know at first, Grace. I swear. I didn't know about your brother, about what had happened. When I found out, I was already too deep. I didn't know how to tell you." Grace stepped back, shaking her head in disbelief. "Too deep? Too deep? You were playing some kind of game with my life? Nathan, you didn't just lie. You let me believe in you. You let me think that you were someone good, someone I could trust." Nathan took a step forward, desperate. "I am trying to be that person, Grace. I know I messed up. I know I hurt you. But I swear, I never wanted this to happen. I never wanted to hurt you." She stared at him, her eyes glassy with unshed tears. "Do you even understand what you did? My brother is dead because of decisions you made, because of the cuts you approved without even thinking about the people who would suffer because of them." "I know," Nathan said quietly, his voice thick with guilt. "I know, and I will never be able to make that right. But I'm trying, Grace. I'm trying to change. I stepped down. I resigned from the company. I'm making sure that things are different from now on." Grace's expression softened for just a moment, surprise flickering across her face. You stepped down?" Nathan nodded. "I couldn't keep running the company the way I was. It wasn't right. None of it was right. I've made too many mistakes." For a long time, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was heavy, filled with all the words they hadn't said, all the feelings they hadn't acknowledged. Nathan watched as Grace's face shifted, the wall she had put up slowly cracking. "But stepping down doesn't bring him back," Grace whispered, her voice breaking. "I know," Nathan said, his own voice raw. "I can't bring him back. I can't undo the pain I've caused. But I can be better. I can make sure no one else has to go through what you did. That's all I can do now." Grace looked away, her arms crossed tightly over her chest as if she were holding herself together. Nathan could see the battle raging inside her. The anger, the grief, the betrayal, and somewhere, maybe, the smallest flicker of hope. "I don't know if I can forgive you, Nathan," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know if I can ever look at you and not see everything I've lost." Nathan's heart shattered at her words, but he didn't try to argue. He had no right to ask for her forgiveness. Not yet. Maybe not ever. "I understand," he said quietly, his chest aching with the weight of it. "I just needed you to know that I'm sorry, that I'm trying to change." Grace didn't respond for a long time. She just stood there, her eyes fixed on the ground. Finally, she sighed, running a hand through her hair. "I need time," she said, her voice steady but distant. "I don't know if I can ever forgive you, but I need time to figure it out." Nathan nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. "I understand," he repeated. They stood in silence for a moment longer before Grace stepped back into her apartment, her hand resting on the door as she prepared to close it. "Nathan," she said softly, stopping him just as he turned to leave. He looked back at her, hope flickering in his chest. "I don't know if you can fix this," she whispered, her voice wavering. but I'm glad you're trying." And with that, she closed the door, leaving Nathan standing in the hallway, the weight of her words sinking into him. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't a promise of anything, but it was a beginning, a fragile, uncertain beginning. Nathan exhaled, feeling the cold air of the hallway settle around him as he turned to leave. He had done what he could. Now, it was up to Grace. Up to her heart, her ability to heal, and up to time. The days that followed were heavy with uncertainty. Nathan returned to a life that felt foreign to him now, one without the weight of running an empire, one where the only thing that mattered was repairing the damage he had done. He kept himself busy, trying to stay out of the way as the hospital adjusted to new leadership, as the world around him carried on. But all of it was a blur, background noise to the ache inside him, the hollow feeling left behind by Grace. She had asked for time, and Nathan had given her that. He didn't reach out, didn't try to force a conversation, but every day he woke up wondering if today would be the day she called. If there was even the slightest chance she'd give him a second chance. And every day, the silence from her only deepened his regret. Weeks passed, and winter began to settle in, the cold biting and unforgiving. Nathan would walk through the city, lost in thought, passing by the hospital without going inside. It wasn't his place anymore. He didn't belong there, and he wasn't sure if he ever would again. It was on one of those cold, gray mornings that Nathan's phone rang. He pulled it from his pocket, expecting another meaningless business call, but his breath caught in his throat when he saw Grace's name on the screen. For a moment, he hesitated, his thumb hovering over the answer button. His heart raced, and he wasn't sure if he was ready for whatever she was about to say. But this was Grace, and he owed her more than just his fear. He answered, "Grace." There was a pause on the other end, and for a second, Nathan thought the call had dropped. But then he heard her voice, quiet and steady. "Nathan, can we meet?" His pulse quickened. "Of course. When? Where?" "Now," she said, her voice soft but firm. "At the hospital. There's something I need to show you." Nathan's heart pounded as he made his way to the hospital. He hadn't set foot inside since he had resigned, and walking through the familiar doors filled him with a strange mix of nostalgia and anxiety. This place had once been the center of his world, but now it felt like someone else's territory, like he was an intruder. He found Grace waiting for him outside one of the smaller wings of the building. She was bundled in a thick coat, her hair loose and slightly windblown from the chilly air. When she saw him, she gave a small nod, but there was no smile. She gestured for him to follow her without a word. They walked in silence down the hall, past patients and nurses, until they reached a door at the end of the corridor. Grace paused, her hand on the handle, before turning to look at Nathan. "What I'm about to show you," she said quietly, "is something I've been working on for a long time. But it's also because of you." Nathan frowned, unsure of what she meant, but he stayed silent as Grace opened the door and led him inside. The room was small but bright, the walls painted in soft, calming colors. There were chairs arranged in a circle, and on the far side of the room, a large window let in the pale winter sunlight. It looked like a meeting space, simple but peaceful. Nathan's confusion must have shown on his face because Grace turned to him with a slight smile. "This," she said, her voice soft but strong, "is a new grief support group for families who've lost loved ones due to medical negligence. It's a place for them to talk, to share their pain, and to heal." Nathan's chest tightened as he looked around the room, the meaning of it sinking in. This wasn't just a support group. This was Grace's way of processing her own grief, her own loss, a way to give others what she had never had, a space to heal. "It's because of my brother," Grace continued, her voice steady despite the emotion in her eyes. "But it's also because of you, Nathan. You made me see that there's more to this than just being angry. There's more than just pointing fingers and placing blame. I've spent so long holding on to my pain, to my anger, but that's not what my brother would have wanted." Nathan swallowed hard, his throat tight with emotion. "Grace, I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," she said, her voice softening. "I'm not saying this to absolve you. What you did, it hurt. And it will take time for me to come to terms with that. But I'm not the same person I was before I met you. And I think Maybe you're not either. Nathan's heart ached as he looked at her. This woman who had every reason to hate him but who stood here, in front of him, offering something he had never expected. Understanding. Maybe not forgiveness, not yet, but something close to it. "I'm trying to be better," Nathan said, his voice rough. "I don't know if I'll ever deserve your forgiveness, but I promise you, Grace, I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying." Grace looked at him for a long moment, her eyes searching his face. Then she took a deep breath, nodding slightly. "I believe you." It was the smallest phrase, but it carried more weight than any apology, any promise Nathan had ever made. He felt a rush of emotion, relief, gratitude, and something else he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a long time. Hope. Grace turned back to the room, her eyes scanning the empty chairs. "The first meeting is next week. Families from all over the city are coming. I'd like you to be there." Nathan blinked, surprised. "Me?" Grace nodded. "You're a part of this, whether you like it or not. You made decisions that affected people's lives, and now you have a chance to face them, to listen, to learn." Nathan felt the weight of her words, the responsibility in them. He wasn't sure if he was ready to face those families, to hear their pain, but if this was what Grace needed, what those families needed, then he would be there. No more running, no more hiding. "I'll be there," Nathan said quietly, meeting her eyes. For the first time in what felt like forever, Grace smiled. It was small, hesitant, but it was real. They stood there together, in the quiet of the room, the space between them still fragile but no longer broken. It wasn't a clean slate, and it wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was a beginning, a step forward. And for Nathan, that was enough. If you enjoyed this heartwarming story about overcoming challenges and family love, don't forget to like the video, comment on what touched you the most, and subscribe to the channel. Stay tuned for our next exciting story.